So then let's look at some themes in contemporary theological ethics about sexuality and marriage and the family. One of those themes is looking at sexuality as primarily an external act or a set of external acts more than as an inherent characteristic of personhood or personal identity. So a focus on the act itself. Or alternatively, a focus on sexuality as essential to our gendered identities and how that affects us personally and how that affects our ethical framework. And in particular, in this viewing of sexuality as primarily external or primarily internal, there will be a focus on deontological rules, principles or rules about the sort of normal buckets of categories of things we would think about when we think about sexuality. So promiscuity, adultery, autoeroticism, divorce and remarriage, polygamy, things like this. And so I think it's probably fair to say that the more the focus is on the act as something external to us, the more perhaps inflexible the rules about these different elements of sexuality might be. Perhaps the more the focus is on sexuality as something that's an inherent characteristic of the person, perhaps there's some more flexibility in some of these rules. That's very much a generalization, but probably a fair generalization. From the ecclesial perspective, one of the main themes is what is the relationship between church, the ecclesia, the called out community, and the notion of the family. And there are some ways in which really ecclesial ethics kind of relativizes the idea of the family. Of course, there's a strong theme in Christian thought about seeing the family as a domestic church or a small church in a sense. And that still remains very much a theme for ecclesial ethics as well. But there's a sense in which there's a question about, well, how does that theme relate to what the church is as ecclesia? There are also uses of household analogies for the church. So the church itself is really the new household, the household of faith, really the primary unit. So where there might be some senses in the tradition of seeing the family as the primary unit, there's this sense of seeing the church really as the primary unit. And within that discussion, there's a lot of discussion about, well, what is the role of women in the church as well as women in the family? I think it's fair to say that in ecclesial ethics, there's, as is the case generally, there's less a focus on deontological rules and more of a focus on relationships and how the relationships within the church form something like an alternative family. And then finally, we can come to the subversive ethics. And as you might expect here, a lot of the question, a lot of the inquiry has to do with the nature of power in relationships, a focus on problems like domestic violence, a focus on problems like how race and economic structures affect families and how all of these things factor into how we might think of sexual ethics and marriage and the family theologically.